Erase Earth, the speaker declared, and let history remember that every civilized nation agreed. The chamber answered with applause, not cheers of triumph, but the cold, practiced approval of governments convinced they were doing the responsible thing. Across the vast circular floor of the Stellar Assembly, 197 national banners shimmered beneath a glass dome large enough to swallow entire city blocks. Every delegate had arrived knowing today's vote would reshape the future of the galaxy. Every camera was live. Every citizen from the core worlds to the distant frontier colonies was watching. At the center of the chamber, Ambassador Nathan Brooks sat alone behind the simple blue and white emblem of the Terran Alliance. His desk looked almost plain beside the polished crystal stations surrounding him. He wore a charcoal suit instead of ceremonial robes, a silver watch that had belonged to his father, and a quiet expression that refused to reveal whether he was angry, afraid, or simply tired. A young aide leaned closer and whispered, "Sir, they're really doing it." Nathan glanced toward the massive voting display without changing his expression. "I know. Should we request another hearing? No, should we object?" Nathan folded his hands. They've already made up their minds. At the highest platform stood Supreme Chancellor Cale Voran, his tailored black uniform trimmed with deep crimson. He did not smile. Men like him never needed to. Confidence had replaced emotion years ago. The Terran Alliance has repeatedly demonstrated that its expanding influence presents an unacceptable long-term threat to galactic stability, he announced. Our responsibility is not vengeance. It is prevention. The wording was careful, almost comforting. That was what made it dangerous. Nobody spoke about hatred. Nobody admitted fear. They spoke about safety, balance, and the future. Words polished until they sounded like virtue. Proceed with the vote, Cale ordered. The enormous display awakened. Nation after nation illuminated across the chamber. Yes, 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 yes. The lights continued spreading around the circle like falling dominoes. A merchant republic from the inner ring. Yes. A military coalition from the Orion corridor. Yes. Independent frontier systems. Yes. Governments that had signed trade agreements with Earth only months earlier. Yes. Nathan watched every light appear without interrupting. Behind him, his communications officer swallowed hard. 112. Another pause. 140. A few seconds later, 183. The room grew quieter as the final nations prepared to vote. Reporters stopped typing. Even the translators seemed to lower their voices. The outcome was already obvious. Cale rested both hands on the podium, completely certain history belonged to him. Final votes, he said calmly. One more light appeared. Yes. Another. Yes. Nathan's aide looked ready to stand. Sir. Nathan gently shook his head. Stay seated. The display counted upward. 196 affirmative votes. Only one nation remained. Cale barely glanced toward the final emblem suspended at the far end of the chamber. The Oran Dominion, he said. Cast your vote. The chamber waited. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. Across the room, High Chancellor Adrian Hale slowly rose from his seat. His silver hair reflected the chamber lights as he looked, not at Cale, but directly at Nathan Brooks. Nathan gave the smallest nod, almost impossible to notice. Adrian took a slow breath. The Oran Dominion votes. Every camera turned toward him. No. Silence crashed into the chamber harder than any explosion ever could. One word. 2 letters. Enough to freeze an entire galaxy. No one moved. Even the translation systems hesitated, as if they needed an extra heartbeat to accept what they had just heard. Then the whispers began. Delegates leaned toward one another. Advisors hurriedly checked their tablets. Reporters abandoned their prepared headlines. Supreme Chancellor Cale Voran slowly turned his eyes toward Adrian Hale. There was no anger on his face, only disbelief. High Chancellor, Cale said evenly. Your vote appears to conflict with the consensus reached during yesterday's closed session. Adrian remained standing. His hands rested lightly on the edge of his desk, steady enough to betray nothing. It does not conflict with my conscience. A few delegates scoffed. Others exchanged uneasy looks. One representative from the core systems laughed under his breath. Conscience does not govern civilizations. Adrian looked at him without raising his voice. Sometimes it is the only thing that keeps them alive. Nathan Brooks remained silent. His communications officer, Claire Donovan, stared across the chamber. He is throwing away everything, she whispered. Trade agreements, military support, political alliances. Nathan answered without taking his eyes off Adrian. Yes. Claire frowned. Why? Nathan did not answer. Across the chamber, Cale folded his hands behind his back and smiled for the first time that day. It was a patient smile, the kind worn by someone who believed every problem had a practical solution. Perhaps, he said, the Dominion requires a brief recess to reconsider. Adrian shook his head. There will be no reconsideration. The silence returned, heavier now. Cale stepped away from the podium and slowly descended toward the center floor. Every camera followed him. High Chancellor Hale, he said, stopping several feet away. You understand that opposing this resolution means standing alone against every recognized stellar government. I understand. You understand your economy depends on coalition trade routes. I do. You understand your border security relies on coalition patrols. Adrian nodded once. I understand that as well. Cale spread his hands. Then help us understand why. Adrian lowered his eyes for only a second, long enough to remember. Because 18 years ago, he said quietly, my people learned something this chamber has forgotten. Several delegates exchanged puzzled looks. Cale's expression barely changed, but Nathan noticed it, just for an instant. A flicker of uncertainty. Adrian continued. When the Kareth plague spread across our worlds, every major power calculated the cost of helping us. The enormous display behind him shifted as archived records automatically appeared. Colony names, population losses, emergency declarations. The coalition determined intervention was economically inefficient. No one interrupted him. Entire fleets turned away from our distress calls. Medical convoys were redirected elsewhere. We were informed that preserving our civilization would require unacceptable sacrifices. Claire looked toward Nathan. I have never heard of any of this. Nathan quietly replied. Most people have not. Adrian lifted his gaze again. There was only one nation that answered. Another archive appeared. Grainy footage. Old transport ships, painted with familiar blue and white markings. Civilian freighters. Hospital vessels. Engineering crews unloading generators beneath gray skies. None of them carried weapons. None demanded payment. The recording ended with exhausted volunteers helping frightened families rebuild homes that no longer existed. The chamber remained perfectly still. The Terran Alliance arrived without asking what they would receive in return, Adrian said. They stayed until our children could sleep without fear. Nathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He recognized one of the ships. His father had served aboard it. Before anyone could speak, warning lights suddenly flashed crimson across the assembly ceiling. Every screen inside the chamber switched to emergency status. A calm mechanical voice echoed through the hall. Priority alert. Unauthorized military formations detected entering neutral assembly space. Defensive protocols activating. All delegates remain at your stations. Cale looked toward the tactical display as dozens of unidentified fleet signatures appeared just beyond the station's perimeter. The vote had barely ended, and somehow, someone had already made the next move. The tactical display expanded across the chamber ceiling, replacing the voting records with a rotating map of the surrounding star systems. Red markers appeared one after another, not racing toward the assembly, but quietly taking positions around it. The mechanical voice repeated, unidentified fleets have established a containment perimeter. No weapons signatures detected. Communications requests pending. Panic would have been understandable. Instead, confusion spread through the delegates. Who authorized this? Someone demanded. Which government deployed those ships? Another shouted. Military advisors rushed between desks, comparing sensor reports that refused to agree with one another. Supreme Chancellor Cale Vorin remained remarkably calm. He studied the formation for several seconds before speaking. Open every channel. Moments later, dozens of transmission windows filled the massive display. Admirals from coalition defense commands appeared one after another. Supreme Chancellor, one officer reported, these vessels do not match any registered military inventory. Another interrupted. Their identification beacons are legal, but the fleet registry is incomplete. Incomplete? Cale asked. That is impossible. We thought so as well, sir. The officer hesitated. Most of these ships have civilian construction records. A wave of laughter rolled across part of the chamber. Civilian ships? One delegate scoffed. Freighters cannot blockade the assembly. Another representative smirked. Perhaps the Terrans hired cargo pilots to scare us. Nathan Brooks quietly looked up at the display. Claire noticed something everyone else missed. Nathan, she whispered, you know those hull designs. He nodded once. I do. Should I be worried? Not yet. Cale turned toward the Terran delegation. Ambassador Brooks, would you care to explain why commercial vessels are gathering around the most secure diplomatic station in the galaxy? Nathan folded his hands. You are assuming they belong to us. Do they not? Nathan answered with complete honesty. No. The room became even quieter. One by one, the unidentified ships accepted the assembly's communication request. Their bridges appeared on screen. None displayed military uniforms. Instead, there were civilian captains, engineers, emergency coordinators, relief directors, and elderly administrators whose faces carried years of ordinary work rather than battlefield experience. The first captain spoke with a calm voice. This is Relief Convoy 12 from the Oran Dominion. Another window opened. Medical Fleet 7 from the Kestrel Cooperative. A third followed. Agricultural Transport Command from the Haven Systems. More screens continued appearing until nearly 40 different organizations filled the display. Claire stared in disbelief. Those are not navies. Nathan quietly replied. No, then why are they here? Before Nathan could answer, an elderly woman wearing a faded utility jacket looked directly into the central camera. 22 years ago, she said, Earth rebuilt our orbital farms after the ash winter. Another captain spoke. Terran engineers restored our water processors when everyone else declared our colony a financial loss. Another voice followed immediately. Human doctors stayed through the red fever outbreak after every private contractor evacuated. Delegate after delegate watched as unfamiliar stories poured into the chamber. None of them had appeared in official coalition history. None had been discussed during the vote. Kill's expression finally shifted. Only slightly, but enough for Nathan to notice. The Supreme Chancellor turned toward his intelligence director. Why were these records excluded from the briefing? The director swallowed hard. Because they were classified as humanitarian assistance operations. They were never considered strategically relevant. Adrian Hale slowly stood again. That, he said, was your first mistake. Before anyone could respond, every civilian transmission suddenly flickered. A new encrypted signal forced its way onto every screen inside the assembly. The source identifier contained no national emblem, no government seal. Only 3 simple words that caused Nathan Brooks to straighten in his chair for the first time all day. Earth Executive Command. The encrypted signal stabilized, and the face of President Olivia Grant appeared above the assembly floor. She was not standing behind a ceremonial podium. She sat inside a compact command room lined with tactical displays, wearing a dark navy jacket with the Terran Alliance emblem stitched over her shoulder. Her expression was calm, almost ordinary, like someone preparing for a long meeting instead of speaking to the entire galaxy. Good afternoon, she began. I apologize for interrupting your proceedings. A few delegates immediately protested. This transmission is unauthorized. Disconnect the signal. Remove them from the network. Every attempt failed. Earth had not hacked the assembly. The emergency communication protocol automatically gave priority to any recognized head of state during a security crisis. Cale Voren narrowed his eyes. President Grant, your civilian vessels are interfering with coalition operations. Olivia answered without hesitation. They are interfering with nothing. They are exercising their legal right to protect humanitarian personnel under Assembly Charter 47. Cale glanced toward his legal advisors. They searched through the treaty database as fast as they could. One of them quietly whispered, "She is correct." The Chancellor frowned. That statute has not been cited in over a century. Olivia gave a slight smile. Laws do not expire simply because people stop reading them. Before Cale could respond, alarms echoed again. This time the tactical map changed dramatically. Bright yellow icons appeared along the outer edge of the civilian perimeter. Unknown warships had entered the sector at high speed. Their hulls carried no national insignia, only dark gray markings commonly associated with private military contractors. Claire Donovan looked up sharply. Those are not coalition ships. Nathan nodded. No, they are hired. The lead tactical officer shouted across the chamber. Multiple unidentified attack cruisers are moving toward the relief convoys. One of the civilian captains appeared again on the screen. The elderly woman from the Haven Systems adjusted her headset with surprising composure. "We have children aboard. We request escort authorization." Kale remained silent. The request technically did not involve coalition forces. Several delegates looked away. Others quietly watched the countdown as the distance between fleets continued shrinking. Nathan slowly stood for the first time that day. "Madam President." Olivia looked directly at him. "Yes, Ambassador?" "Permission to activate Guardian Protocol." Every human inside the chamber stopped moving. Claire stared at Nathan. "I thought that program was retired." Nathan answered softly. "So did everyone else." Olivia took one slow breath before replying. "Permission granted." Across the tactical display, dozens of harmless-looking cargo vessels suddenly changed formation with perfect precision. Heavy shipping containers detached from their hulls and drifted away in organized patterns. Massive support arms folded inward. Protective shielding unfolded from beneath ordinary plating. Rescue ships transformed into fortified evacuation platforms designed years earlier for disaster response, not conquest. They carried no offensive weapons, only layered defensive systems capable of protecting thousands of civilians. The approaching contractor fleet slowed almost immediately. Their commanders had expected frightened merchants. Instead, they found disciplined formations that refused to panic. One contractor captain transmitted an open message. "Civilian convoy, clear the corridor immediately." The answer came from the elderly woman. "Negative. We are conducting lawful humanitarian operations. Failure to comply will have consequences." She smiled gently before answering. "Young man, I have been delivering medicine longer than you have been alive. You are welcome to go around us." Laughter unexpectedly rippled through parts of the assembly. Even several neutral delegates struggled to hide their amusement. Then another alert flashed across every screen. Hundreds of fresh hyperspace signatures had appeared beyond the contractor fleet, and unlike the first arrivals, these ships belonged to governments that had voted to erase Earth only minutes earlier. Something had changed, and whatever it was, the fragile political crisis had just become a race against time. The assembly no longer sounded like the center of civilized diplomacy. It sounded like a room full of people realizing their assumptions had expired all at once. Fresh fleet markers continued appearing across the tactical display, each carrying the transponder of a government that had voted alongside the coalition only minutes earlier. Claire Donovan looked from one screen to another. "Nathan, they are moving their fleets." "Yes." "Toward Earth." Nathan quietly shook his head. "Look closer." She zoomed in on the navigation paths. Every formation was stopping well outside the humanitarian corridor. None of them crossed the invisible line protecting the relief convoys. They were waiting, watching, unsure. Supreme Chancellor Cale Voren noticed the same thing. "Report," he ordered. His intelligence director answered immediately. "No confirmed hostile actions, sir. Every fleet is holding position." "Why?" No one had an answer. President Olivia Grant folded her hands. "Because no government wants to be remembered as the one that fired first at relief workers." Cale looked directly at her. "You arranged this." "No," Olivia replied. "Humanity simply earned trust a long time ago." Across the chamber, Adrian Hale activated another archive. "There is something this assembly deserves to see." An old recording appeared. The image quality was poor, clearly captured decades earlier. A young Terran engineer climbed down from a damaged transport, carrying nothing more threatening than a toolbox. Around him stood frightened Oran families whose cities had been left without power after the plague. The engineer smiled at a small child and handed her the flashlight hanging from his belt. "You keep this until the lights come back," he said. The recording shifted. Doctors unloading medical supplies. Volunteer construction crews repairing schools. Terran cargo pilots sleeping on warehouse floors because every available room had been given to local families. There were no speeches, no treaties, no cameras waiting for applause. Just ordinary people doing difficult work because someone needed help. The recording ended with a handwritten note scanned into the archive. It carried the signature of President Daniel Mercer from 18 years earlier. "We do not help because someone will owe us. We help because one day someone else may stand where you stand now." The chamber remained completely silent. Claire slowly whispered, "That message was never published." Nathan nodded. It was never supposed to be. Kale finally broke the silence. History does not decide the future. Adrian answered before anyone else could. No, but it decides who will stand beside you when the future arrives. At that exact moment, another transmission request appeared. Then another. Then 10 more. Governments that had voted against Earth were suddenly requesting direct communication with President Grant. Their diplomats no longer sounded confident. One governor spoke first. Madam President, before events move any further, perhaps there is still room for discussion. Another added, the vote reflected strategic concerns, not personal hostility. Nathan almost smiled for the first time all day. Claire noticed. You expected this. I expected them to remember who they wanted us to forget. Kale turned sharply toward the communications console. Reject all unauthorized diplomatic requests. The operator hesitated. Sir, they are no longer asking permission from the coalition. They are contacting Earth directly. For the first time since entering the assembly, the Supreme Chancellor's composure cracked. Only for a second, but it was enough. He understood the vote had not isolated humanity. It had isolated him. Then a secure message reached Nathan's private terminal. The sender identification contained only one name. President Daniel Mercer's Legacy Archive. The timestamp read, Open only if Earth stands alone. Nathan slowly reached toward the file, knowing whatever waited inside had been sealed for 18 years, and knowing the next decision could change the fate of every nation in the chamber. Nathan rested his thumb against the secure terminal for a brief biometric confirmation. The archive opened without fanfare. No encryption warnings. No classified seals. Just the recorded face of President Daniel Mercer sitting inside an old office that looked almost outdated by modern standards. Behind him hung a faded American flag beside the Terran Alliance emblem. He smiled as though he already knew why someone would eventually watch this message. If you are seeing this, Mercer began, then someone has convinced the galaxy that standing with Earth is too expensive. That usually means they have forgotten how expensive abandoning each other can become. Every human in the chamber remained silent. Claire looked toward Nathan, but he never took his eyes off the screen. Mercer continued, Do not answer fear with pride. Do not answer betrayal with revenge. Show them the truth they chose to ignore. The recording shifted to thousands of archived humanitarian operations spread across nearly 4 decades. Human engineers rebuilding orbital elevators after solar storms. Fire crews entering burning industrial stations long after insurance companies had declared them total losses. Doctors treating miners, merchants, refugees, and even former enemies without asking who could afford the bill. Every mission ended the same way. Terran personnel quietly packed their equipment and left. No flags raised. No victory speeches. No demands for repayment. Claire whispered, How many operations were there? Nathan answered softly. More than anyone kept counting. Around the assembly, delegates watched the records with growing discomfort. Entire chapters of shared history had never appeared inside coalition archives because none of those missions had produced territorial gains or military advantages. They had simply saved lives. Adrian Hale slowly looked around the chamber. This is what many of you erased from your textbooks because it made power look less important than character. Before anyone could answer, Supreme Chancellor Kale Voran suddenly raised his hand. His voice cut cleanly through the room. Enough. Every display instantly went dark except the central tactical map. The humanitarian archives disappeared. The communication links with Earth froze. Kale had activated emergency executive authority. History is a luxury, he said calmly. Governments survive by controlling tomorrow, not remembering yesterday. He turned toward the military command network. Initiate Directive Black Horizon. The intelligence director hesitated. Sir, that directive has never been authorized during an active assembly session. It is now. Across the tactical display, the contractor fleet abruptly changed formation. They no longer advanced toward the relief convoys. Instead, they accelerated toward the hyperspace relay network surrounding the assembly itself. Claire's eyes widened. Nathan, they are not attacking people. No, he replied quietly. They are targeting the roads. One by one, navigation corridors across the sector began shutting down under coalition emergency authority. Civilian traffic vanished from the map. Commercial communication relays went offline. Relief convoys found themselves surrounded by invisible legal barriers enforced through automated navigation locks rather than weapons. Cale folded his hands behind his back. No shots fired. No treaties violated. The convoys may remain exactly where they are. Adrian frowned. You are trapping them. I am regulating traffic under emergency security law. Several delegates immediately realized what he had done. Without firing a single weapon or threatening a single civilian, Cale had transformed humanitarian fleets into isolated islands. Earth could not reinforce them. Other governments could not legally reach them without violating coalition regulations. Nathan stared at the tactical map for several long seconds before quietly closing President Mercer's archive. Claire leaned closer. Did he just outmaneuver us? Nathan finally looked up, his expression calmer than ever. No, then why are you smiling? Nathan glanced toward the frozen network surrounding the assembly and answered with complete certainty. Because Cale just made the same mistake every arrogant empire eventually makes. He assumed humanity only builds one way into the future. The chamber settled into an uneasy silence as the tactical display filled with red navigation barriers stretching across the sector like invisible walls. Relief convoys remained exactly where they were, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. Several delegates quietly nodded in approval. It was clever. No weapons had been fired. No laws had technically been broken. Supreme Chancellor Cale Voran folded his hands behind his back and spoke with renewed confidence. Civilizations are not conquered by force alone. They are contained by rules. A few scattered voices applauded. Claire Donovan looked toward Nathan Brooks. What happens now? Nathan checked the time on his father's old silver watch. Now we wait. Claire frowned. That is your plan? No, he looked up. It is theirs. She had no idea what he meant. Then the first notification arrived. One of the humanitarian captains requested permission to speak again. The assembly reluctantly approved the transmission. The elderly woman from the Haven Systems smiled politely. We have received your traffic restrictions, Chancellor. Thank you for the clarification. Cale raised an eyebrow. Clarification? Yes. Since your emergency order only blocks interstellar transit, local civilian construction remains fully legal. Before anyone could ask what she meant, dozens of cargo drones detached from the relief ships. Tiny utility craft, each no larger than a delivery truck, floated into neat formation. More drones launched from every convoy across the sector. Engineering vessels unfolded cranes. Fabrication ships activated industrial printers. Survey satellites came online. Claire stared at the display. They are building something. Nathan nodded. Exactly. Cale looked toward his legal advisors. Stop them. They searched frantically through coalition regulations. One advisor finally looked up. Sir, there is no prohibition against emergency civilian infrastructure projects inside neutral space. Cale's expression hardened. Then issue one. Emergency legislation requires a full assembly vote. Across the tactical map, hundreds of construction drones worked with astonishing coordination. Segments of metallic framework slowly locked together. Power relays ignited. Navigation beacons activated one after another. It looked less like a military operation and more like highway crews repairing bridges after a hurricane. One delegate whispered, "What are they making?" Adrian Hale smiled for the first time all day. "A road. That is impossible. Watch." The first completed structure came online. It was not a weapons platform. It was a civilian transit gate built entirely from modular rescue equipment and humanitarian engineering hardware that already existed inside the convoys. Another gate appeared, then another. Within minutes, an entirely new network of legal civilian transit corridors began forming outside coalition control. Claire blinked in disbelief. They are building a second transportation system. Nathan quietly replied. Human engineers have always preferred making another road instead of arguing over the first one. Alarm tones suddenly echoed through the chamber again. The tactical officer looked almost speechless. Incoming traffic confirmed. Cale immediately stepped forward. From where? Everywhere. Fresh identification signals poured across the display. Medical organizations, disaster response fleets, independent cargo unions, volunteer engineering associations. None belonged to Earth. None belonged to the coalition either. They had all changed course after discovering the new civilian corridor. They were legally entering neutral space through infrastructure that had not existed 20 minutes earlier. Cale stared at the expanding network as realization slowly replaced confidence. His blockade had inspired an alternative instead of obedience. Claire leaned closer to Nathan. Did Earth organize all of this? Nathan slowly shook his head. No. We simply taught enough people how to build. Before anyone could absorb what they were witnessing, the central strategic display flashed one final alert. Priority transmission accepted. Sender identification, Coalition Member State 27. Message: we hereby withdraw our support for Directive Black Horizon and request immediate negotiations with Earth. Then another withdrawal appeared. Then another. And then a fourth. The withdrawal requests multiplied so quickly that the tactical display could no longer keep up. Coalition Member State 31. Member State 42. Member State 58. One after another, governments that had confidently supported Supreme Chancellor Cale Voran only minutes earlier quietly stepped away from Directive Black Horizon. Nobody announced dramatic speeches. Nobody apologized. They simply changed course. Claire Donovan watched the growing list in disbelief. Nathan, they are leaving him. Nathan looked toward the chamber floor where delegates were suddenly avoiding Cale's eyes. No, he said softly. They are returning to themselves. Cale stepped back to the central podium, his voice carrying through the assembly with practiced authority. Remain calm. These withdrawals are temporary political reactions. Coalition command remains intact. Before his words had finished echoing, another notification appeared. Coalition Logistics Command had suspended enforcement operations pending legal review. Seconds later, the Joint Navigation Authority announced that civilian humanitarian corridors would remain open until an independent investigation concluded. Cale's jaw tightened. Who authorized that? His communications officer hesitated before answering. Your own advisory council, Chancellor. The emergency vote passed while you were addressing the assembly. Around the chamber, delegates exchanged uncertain glances. The same political machine Cale had spent years building was beginning to move without him. President Olivia Grant remained perfectly composed on the main display. She did not celebrate. She did not criticize. She simply listened. Finally, one of the governors who had requested direct contact with Earth spoke first. Madam President, if diplomatic relations can still be restored, my government wishes to begin immediately. Another leader appeared beside him. Our vote reflected incomplete information. We acknowledge that now. Adrian Hale quietly folded his hands. Truth has an inconvenient habit of surviving longer than propaganda. Claire smiled faintly. I have been waiting all day for someone to say that. Nathan's attention remained fixed on Cale. Do not underestimate him yet. Almost as if he had heard those words, Cale reached beneath the central console and removed a small crystalline authorization key. The chamber instantly fell silent. Every senior delegate recognized it. Assembly Founder's authority. A power so rarely used that most believed it had become ceremonial generations earlier. Cale placed the key into the podium. If the assembly refuses to preserve order, he declared, then I will invoke emergency executive succession. Gasps spread through the room. One legal advisor stood so quickly that his chair fell backward. Chancellor, that authority requires unanimous confirmation from the founding signatories. Correct. Cale looked toward Adrian Hale. And the Oran Dominion is one of those signatories. Every eye turned toward Adrian. Claire's heartbeat seemed loud enough to hear. Nathan. If Adrian refuses, Nathan quietly answered, then Cale loses everything. And if he agrees? Nathan looked at the old silver watch again before replying. Then humanity will still find another road. Cale slowly faced Adrian across the enormous chamber. High Chancellor Hale, he said, his voice almost gentle. Set aside old memories. Think of your own people. Confirm my authority, and the Dominion will retain every privilege it enjoys today. The room became perfectly still. Even President Olivia Grant waited without speaking. Adrian lowered his eyes for a long moment before reaching into his jacket. He removed a weathered object that looked strangely out of place among the polished technology surrounding it. It was a simple metal flashlight, scratched with age and worn smooth from years of use. Claire whispered, "What is that?" Nathan smiled. The one President Mercer gave an Oran child 18 years ago. Adrian held the flashlight above the assembly floor where every camera could see it. You offered me privileges, he said quietly. Humanity gave my daughter hope when nobody else even remembered her name. He looked directly into Kale's eyes. My answer today is the same as it was during the vote. Then, instead of placing his authorization into the founder's console, Adrian slowly closed his hand around the old flashlight, and every delegate in the chamber realized that the final decision was no longer about law. It was about the kind of civilization they wanted history to remember. Adrian Hale looked at the old flashlight resting in his hand, then slowly placed it back inside his jacket instead of inserting his authorization key into the founder's console. The gesture lasted only a second, but it carried more weight than any speech delivered inside the assembly that day. Supreme Chancellor Kale Voran stared across the chamber, waiting for a different outcome that never came. The founder's console remained dark. A calm mechanical voice echoed through the hall. Emergency executive succession denied. Founding confirmation incomplete. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, Kale had no immediate response. The silence belonged to someone else now. President Olivia Grant finally rose from her chair inside Earth Executive Command. Supreme Chancellor, she said, today could have become another chapter in a long history of fear. It does not have to end that way. Kale slowly looked toward her. You have every advantage now. Olivia shook her head. No, we have every opportunity. Around the chamber, more delegates quietly stood from their seats. One by one, they canceled their previous resolutions. The enormous voting display that had once glowed with nearly unanimous approval now began changing line by line. Votes were withdrawn. Emergency orders were suspended. Independent investigations were authorized. The resolution that had seemed unstoppable only an hour earlier slowly disappeared from the official record. Claire Donovan watched the display with disbelief. I never thought I would see politicians erase their own victory. Nathan Brooks smiled faintly. It was never a victory. Adrian stepped forward one last time. There is one more record that should become public today. He activated a final archive recovered from the Orin historical vaults. The image showed a little Orin girl sitting beside a damaged emergency shelter 18 years earlier. The same scratched flashlight rested in her small hands while a tired Terran engineer tightened the last bolts on a portable generator. The lights flickered on across the shelter, and dozens of frightened families quietly applauded. The engineer laughed awkwardly and simply said, "Looks like dinner is going to be a little brighter tonight." Then he picked up his toolbox and walked away before anyone could even learn his name. The recording ended there. No medals, no parade, no monument. Just one ordinary person doing what he believed was right. Many delegates lowered their eyes. They finally understood why entire civilizations had crossed the stars without being asked. Humanity had never purchased loyalty. Humanity had invested in people when there was nothing to gain. Nathan stood and straightened his father's old silver watch before speaking for the first time since the vote. My father served on one of those relief ships. He used to tell me that kindness is strange. It rarely makes the evening news. It almost never changes the world overnight. But if enough people remember it, one day it becomes impossible to erase. No one interrupted him. No one wanted to. Outside the assembly, the civilian transit corridors remained alive with rescue ships, medical transports, engineers, and volunteers from dozens of worlds. They had arrived because someone once helped them without expecting repayment. Earth never called them to arms. Earth simply reminded them who they already were. As the assembly adjourned, delegates filed quietly through the great hall, speaking in softer voices than when they had entered. The tactical displays faded. The emergency alerts disappeared. Only the stars remained beyond the glass dome, shining exactly as they had before the vote. Nathan paused beside Adrian before leaving. "Thank you," he said. Adrian smiled gently. "No, my friend. We were only keeping a promise that should never have needed reminding." Long after the chamber emptied, historians would argue about the treaties rewritten that day and the alliances that followed. But children across the galaxy would remember something much simpler. Empires rose because they possessed power. Civilizations endured because someone chose compassion when nobody was watching. And on the day nearly everyone forgot what humanity had done, one friend remembered. In the end, that memory proved stronger than fear, stronger than politics, and stronger than every vote cast against Earth.